Sorry if my voice isn't all the way there today. I've been sick lately, but I'm sure recording 100 minutes of video is going to be really helpful in that regard. Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it is time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. You know, I haven't covered much new music that came out in 2026 so far. A lot of my focus this year has been on old stuff rather than new stuff, which I'm honestly okay with. After the historically mega-packed year that was 2025, I'm more than happy to actually have the time to go back to old stuff after how insane last year was. But that's obviously not to say there haven't been plenty of things going on regarding new electronic music in 2026. So, yeah, today we got a slightly more actually manageable selection of 33 releases on the docket. Still gonna be super long, mainly because of 3 mini and brief segments that stretch those reviews out to regular video length, but oh well, I'm sure y'all are fine with that. Now, this is admittedly another one of those oops, almost all 7 out of 10s roundups, so reminder that A, 7 means I think an album is good and worth hearing. Everything included here is being highlighted for a reason. And B, there is a difference between the feelings I have and the quarter points I use for, in the decimal ranges of my scores. I'm a fair bit more likely to keep around a 7.7 for more repeat listens than a 7.3, even if I think both were a fun time and worth hearing. Make sure to check out some of those 7s in case they end up being the kind of thing that will appeal to you more, or the 6s for that matter. 6 means decent for me, so that's, yeah. At the end of the day, everything is just my opinion, and you can feel free to disagree with it. Hopefully you know the usual drill, and if you want to know my favorite and least favorite tracks on any given one of these releases, you can find the usual pastebin document linked in the description. I think that'll be enough prelude, though. Let's just get into it, starting off with From Younger Brother, Mutually Assured Distraction. Okay, we're starting with what is technically a $10 Patreon request, although it is actually one that I had already been planning to look into and probably stick in this roundup independently of the request. This is the duo of Benji Voyeur and Simon Postford. The latter more famous for his work as Hallucinogen, and more notably being one half of Spangle. Younger Brother as a duo was active, putting out projects going all the way back in the early 2000s, although this latest album is their comeback together after a lengthy hiatus of nearly a decade and a half. I had randomly seen this on the Bandcamp charts, getting a decent amount of attention, saw Postford's name attached to it, was mildly intrigued by what I heard previewing through it, bought it on impulse this past Bandcamp Friday, and then by pure coincidence, Benji Voyeur showed up to send in $10 to my Patreon page the same day to directly request I cover it in some form. That was awfully nice of him. For the record, I have not heard any of the previous Younger Brother albums, just this one. But as it turns out, I thought this album was great. Now, that this is a project with direct ties to Spangle is very obvious. All these tracks are generally structured in the same way as Spangle tracks and have lots of sounds and production quality in common with Spangle albums. It's mostly super lush and bright and organic down-tempo material with quite a few heavy dub and psytrance influences, and fairly open-ended tracks that stretch on for 7, 8, 9 minutes. Although what stood out to me more about this project was how it differs from your typical Spangle release, namely its focus on pop sensibilities. These are tracks that nearly all have, immediately catchy hooks, often even feature full-on vocals and actual lyrics, mostly delivered by Mirabelle Rose. Some of this stuff can scratch a similar itch as the best material from artists like Delirium or certain commercial trance artists that make down-tempo music, and combining that with the cosmic and open-ended dub structures puts this in a similar boat to something like Natural Selection by Sounds from the Ground or something, albeit again with a lusher and more spacious production style, not as trip-hop-ish. I suppose your mileage may vary on how much that appeals to you, but that appeals pretty directly to my taste. In fact, the album's poppiest and catchiest tracks were quite frequently the tracks that hit the best for me. See the bright and uplifting but melancholic opener I Belong to Nowhere that also brings in some live-sounding drums, or the reprise of pretty much the exact same idea with a different equally catchy tune on At Home in This World. I also really like the thicker disco groove on A Paradox of Witches, the especially pretty ambience of Closer Endless Drift, and the track Walk Away, which brought in a male guest vocalist, Jay Marsh, to contrast with the female vocals on the rest of the album. And that might have been the best tune out of all of them. Though the other half of this album is all instrumental, and that's probably going to be the stuff that appeals most directly to fans of Spangle and who want more stuff like what they do. Like how Ticking in the Attic combines these thicker electronic beats with heavy dub bass lines and flutes and stuff and brings in a bunch of movie dialogue vocal samples, where the title comes from. Or Caravanserai, which even directly reminded me of like the opener on the last Spangle album all the way back in 2017, albeit with a slightly different tune, and live drums, and a 6/4 time signature. Well, I was an even bigger fan of the Tangerine Dream-ish ascending arpeggios all over Glide Path and the way they really built up over time, and especially the second track Tetrachromat, which is probably the most trance-like cut in the bunch and has the most propulsive and cosmic dance groove. That's about all I have to say about this stuff. My thoughts are not exactly complicated, I just had a lot of fun with this and can definitely see myself keeping it around. Make sure to check it out yourself if it sounds like it would appeal to you. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Siriusmo, Bulleten und Blumen. Okay, before we get into the bulk of the roundup focusing on the beginning of 2026, I'm going to highlight 2 extra releases from 2025. This one snuck up on me right near the very end of the year. I didn't have time for it, but I have enjoyed the work of this French house artist from Germany in the past, and I figured he would deliver something worth giving a shot and that other people might be curious to hear about. It's also his first full-length album since all the way back in 2017. I did a video on his last album called Comic back in the day, although that video is quite old and bad and you are really not missing much if you haven't seen it. Album was good though. This new comeback album of his more or less delivers the exact kind of sound I would have expected and executes it about as well as I would have expected. A lot of playful and goofy synth blends with a cartoonish and sometimes funky tone with some harder hitting edges. Well, truth be told, the album is a little on the unwieldy side. I guess he included more tracks to make up for lost time, even if that does lead to an occasionally somewhat hit-and-miss track listing. I can respect the inclusion of tracks like In der Klem or Lame to add weirder flares, even if I have absolutely no desire to ever listen to them again. Though there are plenty of highlights too. The somewhat vaguely Asian-themed Hong Kong house was catchy. The synthesizer has been drinking lives up to its title, but it bangs. Liquid is a crossover with Mr. Wazo that goes over quite crisply and weirdly as one would hope and expect. Tracks like Okay So and Dum Dee Dum really lean into the funkier vibes, while Coco and Meissner Scherter lean into more emotional pianos to back up the synths, and in the former case include like direct text-to-speech quotes from the titular gorilla. And Irgend Vohin is a nice propulsive closer, but my favorite track has to be Every Tree Needs a Friend. Just really like the melody and chord progression on that one and think it ends up adding to a surprisingly heartwarming vibe. So, yeah, that's kind of all I got. This album's probably not going to be a keeper for me personally, but some people are absolutely going to love this stuff, especially if they happen to be tapped into those rougher French and German house scenes and had been, like, really anticipating this return. It gives you everything you probably want from him at this point, and while I wish the experience was a bit more consistent myself, I think there was still enough hitters for me to be feeling a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Koreatown Acid, Glow Up. The other leftover release from 2025 I wanted to shout out was this Korean sample-based house artist who I found out about through seeing Ramon Pang make a post recommending it on Twitter. And even if this wouldn't necessarily be like a retrospective year-end list contender, which is really not saying much considering, again, how insanely packed last year was, I did end up really liking this and wanted to give it a quick shout to make sure it doesn't completely fall through the cracks. It's not an album that gives me all that much to say, but it's just a lovely little collection of grooves and sample chops that happen to hit very nicely for me. Just a bunch of tracks that hard cut up tiny little snippets of pop songs to create new rhythms and patterns and build them on top of solid house and dance grooves. Mostly all of a similar flavor, but that flavor is very tasty. Tracks like Dawn of a New Era and Dreamscape feel like they're cutting up some 90s R&B and airy house pop over footwork-influenced beats. Tracks like Downside and Chasing Time have catchy chopped-up rap samples that sort of remind me of certain Vale Smith productions or certain moments on that Khadija Al-Hanafi album I really loved last year. A track like Glitchy Way to Heaven features more of an old-timey, maybe doo-wop flavor, while Pump It Up goes for classic old-school early 90s house, and the track's Enough and the closer Ching Chi Ka-Ching bring in some lusher jazzy samples and bring in some jungle breakbeats on top. Overall, just a lot of nice, really easily likable sounds here. Make sure to check it out. I'll have to pay closer attention to her stuff going forward. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Orkun A, Iridescent. Next up, the first new album of 2026 I picked up from Bandcamp came from ambient producer Orkun A. This is my third time covering his work. I really liked his Archaic album when he sent that in for a $10 Patreon request a while back, and I also thought his follow-up last year's Spirit Frequencies, while not quite as strong, was still pretty solid and marked some interesting evolutions for his sound. This latest album had me somewhat intrigued just from the album cover, which contrasted from this artist's typical black and white aesthetic and looked to be presenting itself as something more colorful, pulling Kelly Lee Owens' Dream State. And certainly there is something of a lighter tone to this record on average that I think makes for another interesting evolution in his sound. I like how expansive and cinematic a slow burn start is provided by the opener Krow. The title track brings in a whole bunch of glittering synth plucks that have a very chill and relaxed vibe and remind me a lot of the Fortet track Reversed. The track Lys, L-Y-S, kind of does something similar but brings in a much more organic palette of bell sounds, and the 11-minute closer In Full Bloom is pretty impressive in scale and makes for quite the emotionally resonant finish. Some tracks focus on drone pieces which feel darker and stodgier and bring in some harsher arpeggios as seen on the two Cherry Sweet Cuts, Nothing Motion, or Renere. These tend not to be as big highlights for me, but I do appreciate the tonal contrast they provide. Overall, I think my feelings on this kind of mirror my feelings on this artist's previous album. It isn't anything I haven't heard in this genre plenty of times, or the kind of thing that I foresee like really sticking in my memory, but it is well executed for what it is, and I can appreciate him continuing to further evolve his sound into new territory. This is some good stuff. I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Daphni, Butterfly. Now, for the first new release I actually listened to in 2026, it's time for a new offering from Dan Snaith, which seems to have already been rapidly forgotten. I'll admit, the discourse around this particular project got kinda weird. The main topic of discussion seemed to be wondering whether Snaith is completely washed or will ever be releasing any music worth listening to again. Or in some cases, if he ever released anything worth listening to begin with. I even saw a couple of my colleagues float the idea that this album could have been entirely AI generated, which, holy shit, that is a heavy accusation. Not the kind of thing I want to just float around lightly or assume things without evidence. I mean, I guess it's not an accusation that came completely out of nowhere, considering the last Caribou album, Honey, actually did use an AI filter to turn Snaith's voice into sounding like a generic female house singer. In retrospect, I have no idea why we let him get away with that, and now I feel like that is his worst album by some distance. I already wasn't exactly favorable in my own review, but that might be more like in the 3 out of 10 range for me at this point. Coming off such an insultingly half-assed cash-grabby record like that, I can see why people might have been immediately predisposed to dislike whatever he might be doing next. Although, I personally had my fingers crossed for this album to be a bounce back for him, since it does feel like after the runaway success of his Cherry album in 2022, that Snaith was putting more actual care and effort into his work under the Daphni alias than he used to. Cherry was an album that I may not have absolutely loved all the way through and had a couple of skips, but on average was way more colorful and interesting than any of the other material he released under that name, and features a whole bunch of my favorite tracks he's ever made, such as Take Two, Fly Away, and especially Cloudy. That album has gotten way more replay value out of me than I ever would have expected when I covered it, and I still occasionally come back to it even now. Butterfly feels like a direct attempt to replicate that album's success. In fact, it is basically just the exact same album as Cherry again. Though at least unlike Honey, which was also trying to recapture Cherry and couldn't get anything even close to the same ballpark of quality, I did feel like he was much more successful in actually matching the energy of Cherry as an album this time around. He brought that album's greater variety in colorful house bangers, quirky 70s sample manipulations, and uplifting synth excursions. And while there's no moment here that hits the same heights for me as Cloudy, there's no low point as off-putting as a track like Always There. It does actually feel like a more consistent record. A track like Sad Piano House may be as blatant an attempt to just make Cloudy again as you can get, and it's obviously not as big a home run as that. But I can't deny I always have a soft spot for some Sad Piano House, and the piano melodies here are quite nice and hit the emotional note they're going for. I think Clap Your Hands has a really strong bass line, even if the deep-voiced vocal snippet saying the title is maybe a little suspect in its audio quality. And Talk to Me feels like a slightly deeper version of a similar minimalistic idea with a more wobbly, old-school dubstep-ish texture to its bass. Waiting So Long is a big, lushly sampled disco banger in the same vein as the track he made with Sofia Cortesis last year, which I loved. Happy to actually hear him singing using his regular voice without any filters, too. That might be the best track here. Hang also has a fun, chopped-up 70s horn section. I like all the various progressions and evolutions that tracks like Goodnight Baby and Two Maps go through. Josephine has a lot of throwback 90s rave-style organ sounds and House Diva sample chops, which I thought were quite fun. Caterpillar has some bubbly synth cascades, which are quite uplifting, and some synth stabs that feel loosely inspired by The Art of Noise or something. And 11, while as extremely straightforward a melodic house cut as you can get, does make for an effectively satisfying finish. There is also quite a bit of filler on this album, and interludes that don't really go anywhere beyond like a neat little splash of flavor like the tropical and jazzy tones on Miles Smiles or the 60s pop harpsichords and boinging noises on Invention. And I guess the most off-putting track was Goldie, which feels like an attempt to do like a more hip-hop inspired banger but feels pretty empty, and its shouting samples are a little annoying and don't really hook me in. At the end of the day, this is not an album I'm going to die on a hill for. If you thought it was so bland as to be a waste of time, then I would understand. And I can't deny the feeling that Snaith has had a real problem lately of playing things too safe and just sticking to really familiar and well-trodden house formulas that any artist in the genre could also do. I don't think he's doing any of these sounds poorly, and it does feel like it's coming out of a place of love for this particular style, but the longer he stays in this territory, the more he loses his recognizable identity as a producer. Say what you will about albums like Swim or Our Love, but I do feel like there's a sound to those albums that feels a lot more unique to him specifically, and Swim in particular had more experimenting and risk-taking than anything he's put out, maybe ever. Right now, Snaith is definitely at the point where he's getting too comfortable in one spot and could really stand to change things up more, but at least this album, for as blatant a retread as it is, doesn't feel quite as half-assed in actual execution as his last record was. The actual tracks here are pretty solid in a vacuum, and many of them would have hit just as well if they were actually included on Cherry. So, yeah, this album is not a must-listen, but I personally thought it was an enjoyable time. Enough of a bounce back for me to let it get away with a light 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Katia Krow, Moss Eats, The Silence She Left For Me. Next up, we got a new project from Katia Krow. This album is technically a rework of an album he came out with back in 2020, made to coincide with the launch of the artist's new independently managed label K Krow Records. Though I never heard the original project this one was based on, so I'm just treating it as if it were something entirely new. Anyway, this is one of the better projects I've heard from this artist for sure. Certainly has a glitchy and stuttery flavor to it that I don't get out of most of their other stuff, and gives this project a unique identity in the overall context of his catalog. I will admit that it was the kind of thing that really hit for me on first listen, but kind of grew off me the more times I heard it. But there are a lot of really neat standout moments throughout. I think the stuttered tape loops and glitched up bell noises on opener Clocks Run in Absentia make for a pretty intriguing start to the project. All My Screws Were Tight But I Still Shuddered has some nice uplifting manipulations of melodic bass guitars. Many of the album's longer tracks get quite epic and make good use of their larger scale. See the glitchy synths and stutter edited bells on The Raritan River is Cruel and Inviting and I'm New Here, which is probably the sonically densest track in the bunch. Or the more straightforward piano progressions of the title track, which may not evolve that much over time, but hit one of the album's strongest emotional notes. And the album does balance out its lighter moments with darker moments that work quite nicely as well, like the somewhat creepy emptiness and echoing pianos in I Propped Her Silhouette Against the City Grid, or the much more claustrophobic 8-minute Or the Steam Would Have Broken Me that slowly evolves into a relatively abstract noise piece by the end. However, my favorite track here definitely has to be the 17-minute closer, given the very concise title of Federation and exhaustion in the age of manufacture, foreignness in the palace of belonging. Why would you do that? She glimmered under its gleam, and I crave to be refracted off her skin. Trucks from Pennsylvania keep missing me, and I feel very, very sick. This track is one of the warmest and most optimistic tracks I've heard from Katia Krow to date. Its melodic progressions feel very sweet and easily comforting. There's even a pretty solid pulse with some minimal percussion tapping away for most of the track's first half, before the entire mix melts into more ambient textures and bit crushes everything into oblivion. Overall, this is another very solid effort from Katia Krow. Maybe not my new favorite thing I've ever heard from him, but I think I can probably put it as my third favorite full-length album he's put out so far, behind the debut and Whispers from the Block Obscure. I can definitely recommend giving it a shot once again. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Tangents, Cymatic Collusion. Dang, I feel like it's been a minute since I got some, harder edge psytrance that really connected with me. So here's a random Bandcamp daily find from a duo producers from India that ended up hitting surprisingly well for me. This is definitely not going to be the easiest recommendation for everyone, since its 8 lengthy tracks add up to an experience that runs on for about 82 minutes total. But I found its pummeling mixes of 200 plus BPM or whatever, psytrance grooves, and consistently evolving structures to do a good job of consistently holding my attention and keeping me guessing where any given track was going to go next. Things just keep changing and switching from liquid ambience with vocal samples that take influences from the artist's Indian roots, to ultra-propulsive thumping beatwork and floating every which way every minute. There's not a ton to specifically differentiate the tracks apart from each other, but all of them have a lot of moving parts. Some highlights of note include the progressively increasing tempos of Enjoy the Ride, which may have been the album's hardest hitting banger. The track Radio Dark Night makes use of some of the same Jim Morrison vocal samples that Fatboy Slim used on his track Sunset Bird of Prey, which I thought was a cool reference. Desert Rog has a whole bunch of cool bell and vibraphone sounds that probably make for my favorite cut in the bunch. And Breakbeat Tabla lives up to its title with its uses of breakbeats and tablas that occasionally slip into halftime grooves, which stood out more from the crowd. I don't know if this is necessarily going to be the kind of thing I end up keeping around longer term. The length is in fact pretty exhausting, but I can't deny that I did have a really fun time with the material on display here and thought it lived up to the level of bright and colorful detail that its album cover promised. Certainly one of the wilder and more imaginative rides you'll hear in 2026, and I'm feeling a strong 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Charaxes, Voyeur. Okay, got a new project from Charaxes. I've been pretty consistently enjoying the work of this St. Louis-based experimental sound collage artist for a few years now, and especially after the particularly strong Proof of Life album, which I ended up marking as one of my favorite albums of 2025, I was definitely looking forward to whatever they'd be doing next. Although while this latest album has a lot of sounds in common with Proof of Life, from the mildly crunchy breakbeat workouts to the off-kilter and occasionally dreamlike approach to the sample mashups, the final effect is pretty wildly different from that album. Where Proof of Life was probably the most accessible Charaxes album yet, Voyeur might be the least accessible. Or at least it's the most abrasive, intentionally obtuse and challenging listen they've put out to date. If you happen to be more of a fan... If you happen to be more of a fan of industrial and noise music, this might end up connecting more for you than any of their other work. So yes, that does admittedly mean this appeals less to me on a personal level than their last album, big surprise there. But I do have to respect the continued evolution and the refusal to stay in one creative spot. Every Charaxes album so far has felt different from the last one, with maybe the exception of The Waking Year. And I do also have to appreciate how it feels like a further level up for their sound design, which has gotten even denser and more well-layered. Some highlights include the menacing breaks and acid and whispered half-synthetic feeling vocals on opener Dream Generator, the bizarre IDM beatwork bouncing off more peaceful but melodically dissonant vocal ambience, and building up to a pretty epic climax on Morning Dove. That track also transitions directly into the album's single harshest and most abrasive cut of all in D-Scop, which starts delving into harsh noise territory, which is less my thing, but I do have to appreciate how smooth the transition is, and how it feels like such an exciting heightening of stakes and context. Speaking of smooth transitions, I quite like how the lightly off-kilter drums and somewhat comfier ambience of Private Tape segue into one of the album's heaviest bangers, Knowledge Gap. That sort of feels like a more fucked up take on a similar idea to the track Daisy Chain on their last album, with a very similar big breakbeat drop coming out of nowhere, but progressing into weirder and more dissonant territory from there. Beyond that, you can get a track like Ice Cream Sandwich, which feels like it would have fit the most at home on Proof of Life, and its mildly poppier mix of samples, even if there's a more synthetic vibe and the samples all seem to feel like they're in different keys to maintain the off-putting and aggressive atmosphere. The track Sonder floats through a bunch of different mixes of ambience, plastic pop vocal samples, and breaks, and feels like a bizarre amalgamation of like 4 different barely related fragmented ideas, one part of which goes back into the abrasive noise territory. Probably the most unpredictable track here, and definitely grabs my attention pretty well. While the album's catchiest cut is probably the closer, T-Dove, which layers this repeating hook of kill, 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 shoot, 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 you are God, I am God, which sticks in my head pretty effectively while I'm being hit with all sorts of propulsive beat work and strange ambient effects scraping against each other. Though my 2 favorite tracks on this album go for more of a techno-influenced direction, which I found to be pretty captivating. The track Perfect takes these bright pop singer samples and cuts them up into different shapes over a whole bunch of different grooves and beat patterns that range from kinda old school house to more pummeling, surgeon-y traditional techno to even more hip-hop influenced beats at the end. Though my favorite track has to be the 10-minute centerpiece and sort of title track Voyeur, Let Love Be Your Angel, which evolves from fast-paced techno beats and chopped up pianos into intense breaks and dark ambience into mildly lower-key techno beatwork and mildly more approachable ambience as the energy level slowly starts to drift off by the end. The progression of the whole thing gives me similar vibes to something like the Oudiker track Sublimate, while not actually having any sounds in common. It's pretty damn epic and lives up to the scale I would hope for. And there's also like a bunch of interludes scattered throughout, which I suppose help add more thematic context and specifically tie the artist's transgender identity to the overall concept. I think it's most obvious on Rhythm Nation, that samples someone doing a whole screed about how all the new genders these days are a product of the devil or something. Also, there's some samples of what I think is Janet Jackson's Rhythm Nation being juxtaposed against lots of breaking glass sound effects, making an allusion to like how certain mixes of that particular track had the famed ability to brick laptops if played on loud enough speakers. I don't really have interesting things to note about the other interludes, though. They're just kind of there as interstitial breathers, I guess. Some of them I don't notice are separate from their surrounding tracks. But yeah, that's everything I have to say on Voyeur. It's another really solid effort from Charaxes and their most impressive and dense work to date. On a personal enjoyment level, I did get more out of Proof of Life and Colors Tease for being better able to immerse me in their sonic worlds. Although this is a close third, I think this is better than their Ecdysis album. While that was an even more unpredictable listen, that one did sometimes feel like the artist didn't really know where many of the ideas were going themselves, and it could be a little on the messy side, where this album feels like it's bringing together its sounds and influences in a more cohesive package. That may be as crazy and out there as they come, but always feels like it's got a specific direction and plan in mind for how things will progress. I don't know how much I'm going to end up coming back to this one for repeat visits throughout the year, but I do have to respect the amount of work that clearly went into it and the artist's continued creativity. It is certainly not an album lacking in substance, and I can definitely recommend checking it out if all of this sounds like it would be your thing. I'm feeling a strong 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Xylitol, Blumenfantasie. Alright, next up we got another album from Xylitol. I did cover this artist's 2024 album Anemones back in the Volume 16 roundup, and I thought it was a pretty fun, if unmemorable, mix of classic jungle breakbeats and light and pleasant melodies. This follow-up, a little under 2 years later and also releasing on Planet Mu, looked to be more the exact same kind of stuff as was on Anemones, so I'm not going to say I was going into it with like soaring expectations or anything. Though I did come out really liking it. It was a solid improvement on Anemones. There may not be any kind of stylistic change up from what I've heard from her before, still very much sticking to the same formulas of breezy melodies and jungle breaks. but I do feel like the melodies in particular were hitting a fair bit better than last time. There's a lot more of an immersive atmosphere to this one too, the kind of thing that hits more on a similar level to her label mate Mimo Kama's Loverboy album from a few years back, but maybe even with a little more variety. A track like Chromophoria with Sculpture lives up to the colorful promise of its title in all its glittering descending melodic cascades, while the title track just feels a lot more open and expansive and heartwarming despite its melodies being so low-key and minimal next to all the crashing breaks. Melancholia feels like her take on a similar uplifting idea to Square Pusher's Beep Street, but covered in lots of spooky dark ambience that sounds like howling wind. Lights delivers a similar spacey idea that reminds me a little of Ski Mask's Dolan Tours, while Südwest Wind feels much more intimate and comfy, a little Bogdan Rosinski-ish maybe. It's all the same musical ingredients every time, but I feel like there's some much more specific comparison points I can point to, so it never feels like it's running together. But it's also never to the point to feeling like shallow bootleg versions of better music are the kind of thing that gives me the urge to listen to those other artists instead. And there's also a few moments here that don't stick quite as stiffly to the established formulas. Murjana slows the tempo down to more of a hip-hop pace, but still manages to be one of the album's biggest and brightest and liveliest bangers. Bode Clusters with the Leaf Library brings in a whole bunch of wordless female vocals for extra airy texture that never failed to grab my attention. And Falling brings in this pitched-up soul sample to really give this mix more of an easily memorable hook than anything else here. Really strong finish. And I suppose there's also a couple of interludes for extra flavor as well. Tilted Arc goes from some minimal melodic ambience, while Halo feels like some kind of gritty hip-hop banger made out of video game blips and old-school electro drum machines. Both definitely add more to the overall experience, and neither are skips for me. Overall, while this isn't necessarily a mind-blowing experience for me, and it's not exactly reinventing the wheel for this genre, it has kept growing on me every time I put it on. Maybe this will even be the kind of thing I end up keeping around longer term. Very good stuff, don't really have much of anything to complain about here. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it as well. Next up from 808 State vs. Humanoid, In Place of Language EP. God damn, now this is one hell of a crossover. Graham Massey, the sole remaining active member of 808 State, linking up with Brian Dugans, aka Humanoid, aka one half of the Future Sound of London, and making an entire project together, even if a short one, sure as hell was not on my bingo card for 2026. Anyway, the EP is pretty good. Not really near either artist's best work or anything I expect to really stick in my mind longer term, but it's pretty neat. I will say I did find the second half of the EP was a fair bit stronger than the first. The first two tracks, Optica and Vasco, run through various 90s acid techno throwbacks, which sound like stuff that could have come out in 1990 and adhering to exactly the kind of sound you would expect when you see the crossover between these two artists on paper. They certainly bang for what they're going for, but aren't exactly anything mind-blowing. Though I got more excited when the track Raid really got like even more propulsive and dense with all this intense synth bass that remind me of 808 State's heaviest bangers like In Your Face and Cubic and stuff. And the track Ruby-chan brought some trumpets into the mix, which I thought were a pretty cool addition too. So yeah, nothing from this project is going to go toe-to-toe with the actual best work these artists have put out in the early 90s, but it's a fun throwback to be sure if you just want a bit of 90s nostalgia and you just think the idea of these two artists hooking up sounds as cool as it did to me. So I'm feeling a strong, solid 7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Neue Grafik, Rachael. Next random Bandcamp find comes from this British producer combining jazz, house, acid, classical, and even R&B influences to pretty interesting results. Well, a lot of the time it's more putting tracks in those genres next to each other rather than blending the influences together more seamlessly, but it still results in a pretty well-varied experience, and the execution of those ideas more often than not ends up pretty fun. Perhaps there are some cuts that fall into the more background music-y side of things and don't necessarily stand out within the genres they're going for, like the fairly straightforward acid house of Voigtkampf 808, the more plastic jazz-tinged deep house of 1200 Prophecy, or the R&B slow jam Bold featuring Jerome Thomas. Cool that ideas like those are all next to each other, but maybe not each standouts in their own right. Though other moments here were able to hit on an even deeper level for me. Any of the tracks with string sections really hit for me, like Opener and Closer, Rachael Part 1, and Rise of A, which focus on the strings on their own but feel really emotive and expressive. Or Rachael Part 2, that combines the strings with an 808 and synth-backed instrumental that has a bit of an R&B flavor to it that felt more interesting. Also quite liked Narcissus 909, and the way it combined bouncing but heavy burial-style beat work with wiry and more intimate synths that added up to a more mysterious effect. Feels like something you could hear out of the drum, maybe. And the track Childhood Memories has a whole jazz ensemble to join a more fast-paced drum and bass-inspired groove, and that was really nice. So yeah, this is a good album. Don't know whether this will end up being a keeper, but there was definitely enough cool stuff here to recommend giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Flying Lotus, Big Mama EP. Dang, is it just me, or does it feel like the public stock in Flylo has been going down at an alarming rate lately? I personally was pretty excited for this EP since it seemed to promise a level of energy and flair and color that his work hasn't had to the same extent in a minute, just off the promise of the packaging. Although I also feel like he may have completely ruined whatever hype was present when he posted a teaser on Instagram that had AI-generated visuals. Credit to him for at least recognizing what a tone-deaf mistake he'd made immediately. Like, after fairly massive backlash, he took the teaser down in, I believe, less than a day, and replaced it with more actually impressive stop-motion and human-drawn cartoon visuals later. It does feel like he got the message on how much that kind of thing is going to be tolerated, and that is good. But it did still feel weird that he, of all people, would even make the mistake of even thinking his fanbase would be okay with anything AI generated in the first place, right? Seems like a pretty fundamental misread of what your audience actually likes about your work. On top of that, this EP got met with a whole bunch of mixed reviews once it actually came out. There was just a lot of not very good vibes going around the release of this thing. Now, at least on a personal level, I did think this EP was pretty fun. Certainly a step up from his last Spirit Box EP that everyone's already forgotten existed. I respected that this felt like a change of pace for him into this much more video game-like sound, which doesn't quite resemble anything else he's done. Not to mention, my biggest issue is probably just how ridiculously short it is, only 13 minutes of music total. I could think of worse things to say about a record than leaving me feeling like I wanted more of it. Those 13 minutes are certainly trying to run at as breakneck a pace as it can and stuff in as many ideas as it possibly can, which leads to it living up to the level of wild craziness promised by the cover. Highlights include the bright flashiness and melodic chaos of functional opener Captain Colonel, the crazy sound effect romp of Antelope Onigiri that feels like it's got 10 different distinct parts while not even breaking the 2-minute mark total, and the heavily chiptune flavored In the Forest Day, which lives up to feeling like as much of a video game theme as it was trying to be. And while the second half of the EP is a little less crazy, it's still fun too. I also think Robo Basher has a fun build-up from low-key pianos eventually turning into pummeling techno, and Horse Nuke goes from minimal ambience into bright melodic arpeggios into other techno beat workouts. Not really anything to that track that wasn't done better on another track on the EP, but whatever. And the 30-second intro and outro are pretty flavorful too in similar ways. I'll admit that none of these tracks really have anything in the way of hooks or feel as well fleshed out as they could. It is a surprisingly background music-y listen for how much crazy stuff is going on, but I feel like there could be potential for something if he really were to build upon these ideas in the context of a fuller album. I don't know, I cannot call it one of his very best projects, nor do I see myself, like, really keeping it around, but I certainly didn't think it was boring, or the kind of thing that I couldn't appreciate the imagination that went into it. At the end of the day, it kinda just makes me want a new Flylo album, even if it's another Flamagra-type cluttered mess. I still felt like that record really took me on a journey, still think it's kinda underrated. I'd like something with more meat on its bones like that, but I guess in the meantime, this was still fun for what it was, and I can't take that much issue with what he delivered here, so I'll let it off with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Renere, Dreamdeathdream. Alright, it's time for the long-awaited third album from indie synth pop artist Renere. At least I've been awaiting it for a long time. Guy hasn't put out a full-length project since 2019, although he did break the silence with the Release EP in 2024, which I really liked. felt like an improvement for his style across the board and had me curious as to what he'd be up to next. Now, this album does also mark a bit of a shift in style. It's a lot more of a rock album than I'd expected, with a lot more guitars to add on to his typical depressing and moody synth-pop blends. So, that does admittedly appeal to me less on a personal level than what I heard on his last EP. But I still appreciate the continued evolution, and I don't think the sound is poorly executed for what it's going for. Still hits on all the big dramatic emotions and has the melodies to back itself up, even if the experience might be a slight hint on the samey side. The opener, A World You'll Never See, did throw me off a decent bit with how loud and distorted the guitars got. Just wasn't expecting him to start going into that particular style. But once the album gets into the swing of things, it settles into a pretty effective vibe, combining his previous style of spacey bedroom synth pop with a lot more shoegaze influences. Highlights for me include Introduction, which slips a bit back more towards his familiar synth-pop style, and just hits on some of the album's strongest melodies. Despondency did lean even further into the shoegaze influence, but hit particularly well on that note with its more impressionistic blends of chords. All Gone was the album's darkest and most foreboding cut on an instrumental level, with a lot of heavy bass surrounding the mix in a cool way. Kill Me Nostalgia had a particularly impressive and dramatic chorus, and possibly his best vocal performance yet. Guy's still not exactly the best or most on-key singer on average, but it is not a poor fit for the style he's going for. And I guess the closer Slow Trance was neat too, falling back towards a lower-key synth instrumental and with an outro of whistling. I don't know if that one's as big a highlight for me as some of these others, but it fits sequencing-wise as a comparative exhale of relief at the end, even if the lyrics of wanting to escape to a dream world and not being able to don't carry as semi-relieving a tone as the instrumental. I don't have that much to say about the lyrics on this thing, besides they're all about as depressing and despondent as I would have gone in expecting with any Renere release. But yeah, that's about all I have to say on Dreamdeathdream. I suppose it's not my favorite work I've ever heard from Renere, maybe a bit on the slow-paced side despite only just being under 40 minutes total, but I went in expecting slow and depressing, so that was fine for me. And I did all around enjoy it. It is another solid effort that comes together pretty well. Also completely unrelated, but he's also been advertising the demo of a 3D platform game that he also did the soundtrack if you want to check that out as well and you're feeling like a banana peel lately. But yeah, in the meantime, Dreamdeathdream gets a 7.3 out of 10 for me. Next up from Cylle, Terra Research Facility. Next up, we got a new project from the artist previously known as Shy. I've enjoyed the work she's put out under that name in the past, such as Obscura in 2020, or To Where Wings Rust in 2021. I covered those way back in the Volume 3 and 5 roundups, respectively. She had a particularly unique and easily recognizable blend of organic abstract sounds with a lot of cool assemblies of bells and chimes and various other textures. That was all really immersive anytime I put it on. Can definitely still recommend those projects if you haven't heard them before. It's obviously been a very long time since the last time I heard some new music from her, but now she's returned with a new album under a new alias called Cylle. And as per the change in stage name, there's also a pretty big change up in style. No longer are we operating in experimental ambient territory. This album is sticking to much more overtly electronic sounds and much more traditional blends of house and garage. Still got a couple of the more abstract flares sticking around, but just on an aesthetic level, it's completely different from anything I'd heard from her before. Loosely centered around a sort of sci-fi concept about aliens who reached Earth thousands of years in the future after humanity went extinct, and the aliens uncover music CDs, and the CDs still miraculously work. Now, I will admit that the result is an album that might not stand out as much from its surrounding genre as the work I'd heard from her previously. As far as these blends of deep house and garage go, I have heard absolutely no shortage of material in a similar vein, and these aren't tracks that have like a lot of sticky hooks or that kind of thing. But it is still a fun time, and I do feel like the underlying appeal and strengths of this album might not be quite as far a cry from her old stuff as it might initially appear. The textures may be a lot spacier, more synthetic, and more conventional by the standards of this genre, but it still feels like it's trying to be a fairly textural listen with a lot of abstract arrangements of bell synth melodies peeking through the house and garage grooves. Highlights for me include opener Maintenance, and the way it evolves from minimal textural melodic plex into eventually becoming the album's loudest and most propulsive banger by the end. I like the glitch hop inspired mix on hi-fi, and the way all the synthplex and beats hit on a much more abstract and unpredictable note, while also still maintaining a solid groove. I also really like Kronos for a lot of the same reasons. That one's got a bit more of a stomping, somewhat hip-hop-ish beat, with more delicate chiming melodies to go alongside it. Viviperi may be my favorite track here, since I really like the low-key blend of stuttered samples, which reminds me a little of certain parts of, like, I don't know, the Fields from Here We Go Sublime. Probably the closest the album comes to getting a hook to stick in my head, even if it falls into more experimental ambient sections by the end. The track Cryophyte moves at a way faster pace and tempo than all the other tracks go, and feels really refreshing, especially in its second half when it breaks out into all these gorgeous string sections. So all those tracks are big standouts. Other cuts here like Greenhouse or Bioluminescence or Artifact might be pleasant in the moment and have more nice melodic textures but fall in the background pretty easily. And I guess the closer Spore and the hidden bonus track Coral make for a nice little brisk and breezy finish that give me some Fortet-ish energy. Overall, this is a very solid album. While maybe there is a part of me who wishes it stood out to me a bit more, I don't think any of it is poorly executed for what it's going for, and there are more than enough really cool standouts to make it worth giving a shot, so yeah, I think I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this. Next up from System 7, Flower of Life. Now, here's a name I wasn't expecting to show up, but that I'd been meaning to look into for a while now. System 7 is the long-running psychedelic ambient and techno duo of Steve Hillage and Miket Garati. Both artists were active together going back as far as the psych rock scenes in the early mid-70s, but this particular project started in the early 90s. And of course, I primarily know these two for being some of the most frequent collaborators with The Orb. They co-wrote and co-produced classic Orb tracks like Supernova at the End of the Universe, Backside of the Moon, and of course, Blue Room. And both Hillage and Garati keep semi-regularly showing up on Orb albums all the way up through present day, and vice versa. Alex Patterson is a regular behind-the-scenes collaborator on System 7 albums, going back as far as their first album, and some of the names you see on early Orb albums also show up in their credits, like Youth, Louis Keogh, even once Chris Weston, among others. Although System 7 also have a surprising amount of collaborations with like old school techno legends, including several crossovers with Derek May, and a couple of appearances from Carl Craig and even a guy called Gerald. Needless to say, System 7 felt like the kind of name I should be more intimately familiar with than I am. The only work I'd heard from them as lead artists previously was the album Route 77 under their Mirror System side project name in 2024, which was a nice time if not one that stuck in my mind. But when I just happened to see this comeback show up on the Bandcamp charts by coincidence one day, the first mainline System 7 album in over a decade, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to catch myself up on their stuff. So I went back and heard all their previous mainline albums, and here's my quick thoughts on those. This is a blend of super sunny dance pop, deep house, and trip hop that feels like a cross between, like, Faithless years before that band existed, and some of the more electronic heavy parts of Primal Scream Screamadelica. It's not on streaming. I had to really scour some deeper corners of the internet to find it. But while I would say it's like an interesting curiosity, I'm gonna be honest and say you're not actually missing anything absolutely essential here. It sounds cooler described on paper, but in execution falls a little much on the like overly happy and poppy side, to the point of cheesiness. I mean, it's alright, I just don't really foresee myself coming back to it. This is considered their first real album that sets down the usual style they'd focus on for the rest of their career, a switch over to an entirely instrumental psychedelic ambient techno sound that also feels like some of the early bases for what would become trance music. Very solid for what it is, and got markedly better on second listen. May have to keep it around to see if it further grows on me. The closer in particular was a big highlight. Next up, a double album, two different interpretations of the same set of tracks, a Fire album mostly of techno bangers in the style of their last album, and a Water album of alternate ambient versions. I mean, there's nothing like UF Orb tier here or anything, but they're both enjoyable enough in the same sort of vein as that. This is the one I feel like I most frequently see marked as their best album, and I think I'm inclined to agree with that reputation, even if it would be a close call. It very much lives up to the vibe promised by its cover, exactly as bright, refreshing, summery, and late 90s early CGI coded as it looks. and that Osmosis suite in the second half might be the highest high point in their catalog. That was great. This one's got a lot more stylistic variety. Got some break beats, got some heavier techno, got a bit of drum and bass, got a jazzier track with Talva and Singe on it, though all carrying the same general uplifting vibe as the last album. It doesn't seem to be a popular one among fans, and it doesn't have any high points as high as the last one had, but I still all around had fun with it. I think it's one of their better efforts. This is their most straightforward dance album yet. Not nearly as refreshing or uplifting as Power 7, but if all you need is the propulsive techno and psytrance grooves, they've gotten you more than covered. This is pretty much just a repeat of the last album. And so is this one. Got a few more down-tempo cuts and one with some fun chanting vocals on it, so it is a little better, but it's mostly more of what you'd expect. This is also more of the same, but I did have quite a bit more fun with this one. Like, having two really good A Guy Called Gerald crossovers, especially that opener, certainly helps. And the track Funky Gong was a pretty attention-grabbingly bizarre turn. Though even the regular minimal techno and house fare did feel less autopilot-y and more refreshing on average, at least to me. It's definitely my personal favorite of their later period work. It might also be a keeper. And here's a minimal techno record so minimal it makes their last handful of albums look like the Future Sound of London in comparison. I mean, it's fine, but it's gotta be the least interesting album they had put out yet. It is also technically one half of another double album with the down-tempo companion disc N-Port released under their side project named Mirror System. I skipped over talking about the Mirror System albums in the interest of time, though what I heard briefly previewing through N-Port sounded quite a bit more sonically interesting than anything here, with more the instrumental flair that the regular System 7 albums haven't had as much since the 90s, so I guess take that as you will. So that brings us to here. While the duo have kept busy with collabs and side projects, their last mainline System 7 album was over a decade ago now, so this is a comeback that's been a pretty long time in coming. Given their work after the 90s stuck a lot more to fairly standard techno formulas without really iterating upon them as much, I had a feeling I knew what to expect out of a new album even all these years later. Wasn't exactly going out of my mind with anticipation for this, but maybe the much longer than usual wait could produce some more interesting results. And as it turns out, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call this anything earth-shattering either. It's still an extremely straightforward minimal techno record that sticks to all the same kinds of sounds and formulas they've been sticking to from 7th Wave onwards. But this particular batch is certainly a step up from Export. I think it's roughly on par with maybe their Phoenix album back in 2007. I do have to say there are two really big highlights for me on this one. The first one being the opener, Still Wind, which brought in a whole bunch of different melodic passages and instrumental layers that haven't been present in the same way on System 7 albums since like the 90s. Really strong attention-grabbing start to this thing. And the track Atmosphere was quite handily the album's biggest and most exciting banger. There's a heaviness and bassy menace to that one that makes it feel like it's carrying even more weight than all the heavy techno bangers surrounding it. Although Transceptor isn't too far behind, moves at an even faster pace than most of these tracks and reaches some pretty hard-hitting drops. Also mark the title track as a highlighted note. All the melodic guitar plucking on that one gives it a more colorful and uplifting flavor compared to most of the rest of the track listing. Beyond that, it's all pretty run-of-the-mill techno bangers, which tend to grab me more for like specific parts rather than the whole thing. Like La Katrina has this whole breakdown near the end where Hillage is doing like guitar soloing following the melody of like an old classical piece. That was fun, even if it was just one brief moment in a track that doesn't stand out otherwise. They brought in Matt Black of Cold Cut on the track I Want More, which was fun. That had some mildly catchy vocal sample interjections, I guess. The ambient album outro Bonjour and the remix of a track by Delia Derbyshire Appreciation Society are both things that exist, I guess. Ironically, the track that ended up interesting me the least was their crossover with the Orb, called Beulah. I guess the Orb themselves have not exactly been putting out their best work lately either, though there were a bunch of tracks on Buddhist Hipsters that I found more exciting than this fairly middling techno jam, including the System 7 collab on their album, Spontaneously Combust. So take that all as you will. But yeah, that's about all I got. I have a feeling this probably would have hit better if I hadn't just sat through the band's entire back catalog in fairly close proximity to it. Since even in this album's least interesting moments, you'll still be getting lots of solid psytrance and techno grooves that go particularly hard, It meets the expectation of what you'd want out of a new System 7 album in 2026, and it is a good time in the same way any new, say, Gabriel Lamar or Safi Brothers album might have been lately. I just wouldn't hold your breath for something that, like, really surpasses the baseline expectations for what a new System 7 record would entail. So, yeah, it's a good album, neither one of their best nor one of their worst. I will let it off with a very light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Nathan Fake, Evaporator. Alright, got a new project from Nathan Fake. I was definitely interested in what this guy would be delivering, especially having really enjoyed his last 2 albums. I really liked Crystal Vision in 2023, but especially Blizzards in 2020, which is probably his masterpiece, and I do still semi-periodically come back to that one. I was all the more intrigued seeing some guest features on here like Clark and Dextro, the latter who made like a post-rocky album I heard and enjoyed, although didn't review about a year and a half ago. Oh, I will admit this particular round of tracks didn't quite hit for me on the level of his last 2. It's still a pretty decent album, but a lot of it is fairly plain in its construction and left me wanting to get into it more than I did. It comes off like a less interesting or flavorful version of, like, what Rival Consoles did on his album last year. Especially in the first half of the project with tracks like Yukon and Bialystok that focus on overly simplistic minimal house arrangements, or the opener Iowa, which does have a neat progression from some, like, low-key garage-style mix, but ends up with something almost shoegaze-inspired by the end, although otherwise fell in the background for me super easily. I was also hoping the Clark crossover Orbiting Meadows would grab me more than it did, although it's kind of just an interlude that's there, and maybe has some neat piano in the second half, I guess. Though there are still plenty of tracks here that were able to pull me in more effectively. Hypercube is a highlighted note for being easily the most energetic and hard-hitting track here. You'll Find a Way is probably my favorite cut for having the most striking melodic progressions through its squirtier synths. The 9-minute climax piece Slow Yamaha, well, not my favorite track Nathan Fake has done on that scale, and takes a while to really get going, is a generally fun time. Some of the lower key tracks went over pretty well too. I quite like the tranquil ambience on Sunlight on Saturn. I thought the interlude The Ice House had some cool bell-like synth textures that stuck out to me a bit more. And the track with Dextro, Balta Sound, also ended up being a nice highlight with some of the post-rocky influences that showed up on the album I heard from that guy. Overall, there's nothing absolutely essential here that's going to change your life. Evaporator is unfortunately a bit of a fitting title since it's likely to evaporate from my mind. But yeah, I don't think any of it is poorly made for what it is either. It was a nice vibe in the background anytime I did put it on, so yeah, on the higher end of decent for me, strong 6.7 out of 10. Next up from Spunkshine, Siege Engines, probably. Okay, now we're talking. It's time for another new Spunkshine album. Always gonna be looking forward to seeing what that guy has to offer. This particular batch of tracks isn't necessarily one of my biggest favorites he's delivered in more recent years. I think I did like his previous one more than this, but this is certainly a much tighter listen. It doesn't run over for like, an hour and a half. And it's just as fun and playful a time as I would always expect it to be. All the same abstract blends of up-tempo foot-tapping breakbeats and major key melodies, swapping between various textures and occasionally slowing down for some lower-key, more down-tempo material. There's plenty of highlights across the board as to be expected. The album starts on a really strong note with Classification Failure, flashing through all sorts of bright and optimistic melodic flares with some pianos and horns on the side, going over some foot-tapping breaks, immediately followed by the wobblier, harder-hitting, and mildly funkier touches a sort of title track Siege Engines. I really like all the various horn blares going through Toxic Optimism, and the track immediately before, We Let It Run, has among the more exciting progressions, starting with abstract mechanical effects before stabilizing into thumping, slow-paced techno beat work and minor key wobbling chords and evolving around into other places. Its function remains assumed rather than confirmed also hits in much the same way that track does. I especially like the second half of this track that brings in a whole bunch of very bell textures. And I can also mark the closer Uncertain Objects as a dramatic highlight as well, with big faux orchestral flares. Definitely finishes the album out on a climactic note. Now, as often tends to be the case with Spunkshine albums, there are also plenty of tracks here that kind of just fall in the background without standing out to me. In particular, there's a stretch of more down-tempo cuts near the end, from like Unexplained Torque to The Sound Persists Regardless of Oversight, which didn't really elicit any strong reactions out of me or deliver anything that plenty of other mid-tempo Spunkshine deep cuts over the years haven't before. but they're also not such a drop in energy as to undercut the overall pacing. There have definitely been Spunkshine albums in the past that felt much more inconsistent or lopsided than this one. So yeah, at the end of the day, Siege Engines probably is another solid collection of tracks from Spunkshine as to be expected. Neither exceeds nor falls below my usual expectations, but I always expect a good time out of anything he releases and got exactly what I thought I was going to get, so there you go. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Thorjn, Somewhere. Next up, we got a new project from Thorjn. I've enjoyed the bright and flashy, like, OPN-inspired glitchy ambient mixes he's delivered over the past couple of years on his albums Full Body Sprain and Through the Crystal Window, so I was interested in hearing what he was doing next. Although this latest album is a pretty massive change-up in style that does not particularly resemble anything I've heard from him before. It almost sounds like a completely different artist made this. This album is way more intentionally lo-fi and delves much more into experimental drone and musique concrète adjacent territory, with a lot of fuzzy effects emulating damaged VHS tapes and the like, with even a few light guitars and extremely understated and half-mumbled vocals. The mix here reminds me a lot of that Miffle album from the end of last year, or especially the more abstract work of the artist Haunted Disco. It's a fairly familiar aesthetic, making something that sounds intentionally damaged and finding emotional resonance in the brokenness of everything. It's just very much not the kind of sound I was expecting out of this artist in particular. Now, in execution, I'm not going to pretend this is the most impactful material I've heard in this vein. If there's anything this album has in common with his previous two efforts, it's the fairly unstructured approach to these compositions that can kind of meander around without ever really trying to form any tunes or being the kind of thing that sticks in my memory. But still, I can't deny that it is a very nice and pleasant listen that effectively hits on the forlorn emotional note it's going for. I like the various fragmented sections of Opener Castle Song, the melted field recordings and pianos and synth drones floating through Wish, the somewhat more lighthearted breather provided by the broken ambience of Cloud Primes, and I think the album's ending stretch is quite climactic with the broken up guitar pieces on Blood Repeater, paying off into a pretty triumphant final section. I think that track might have been my favorite here, though I did also find the 9-minute closer Neck to be quite impressive as well, with lots of different evocative ambient sections that sort of build off one another. And the Bandcamp bonus track Robins was a nice little interlude with some nice chiming sounds. I was less of a fan of the tracks that put more focus on, like, the vocals, with certain parts of the title track, or especially the Bloomfish that has this whole, like, incomprehensible spoken section in the middle that I wasn't crazy about. The mumbly, deep voice tone of the vocals wasn't really to my taste in general, but they're far from intolerable either, and I suppose they do fit for the tone the album is going for. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on Somewhere. Maybe not my favorite work I've heard from Thorjn, but I certainly have to respect the massive swerve it took. I'm always in favor of artists changing up their sound, trying new and unexpected things like this, and pushing out of their comfort zones. It is certainly proof that Thorjn is not an artist to be pigeonholed, and even when taken on its own outside of the context of the swerve it represents, it's an all-around nice time and will hit well if you're looking for something more profound and emotional in this vein, so yeah, well, I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Next up from Ochre, Oversail. Oh hey, got a new album from Ochre. Been a minute since I've heard some new stuff from him. Not since I caught myself up on his back catalog when I covered his 2021 ambient album An Eye to Windward way back in the Volume 5 roundup. Guy's made plenty of warm and comfy IDM mixes I've quite enjoyed in the past. Well, I will be honest and say really only two of his albums have really stuck with me longer term, those being his 2004 debut A Midsummer Night's Dream and his third album from 2009, Like Dust to the Balance, which might have actually grown to become my favorite of his albums now. The rest I remember liking, but in a much less specific way that didn't really inspire me to want to come back to them. But I was still interested enough in hearing what he might have to deliver this time around. And yeah, my feelings on this album mirror my feelings on what I remember of most of his back catalog. It's another solid collection of fairly warm and comfy glitchy IDM mixes, which while enjoyable in the moment didn't exactly blow me away to the point of standing out from the crowd that much. It is definitely one of the more traditional synth-focused records, like his debut, rather than including much in the way of other more organic instrumentation as other albums of his, like Dust in the Balance, could often do. Though the synth mixes are certainly dynamic and well-layered enough to carry my attention and feel like they're adding up to the same effect as some of his other more instrumentally extravagant albums, I suppose. There are some really solid standout moments on here, most notably the opening track Skyway, which hits you with all these hard-hitting, buzzing synth bass sequences and builds all sorts of ornate melodic layers on top over time and gets particularly epic and impressive. That track was great. The rest kind of fell back into the same general vibe I would have expected from a new Ochre release, though other highlights include the warmer and more emotional melodies of tracks like Slow Blink, Poire Noire, and Meristem that all get quite expansive and cinematic feeling, as much of his best material can. I also quite liked Casadastra and its blend of a slower and low-key, more dubstep-influenced mix. Other tracks here like High Wire and Bristlecone had a more playful and upbeat tone, which I guess was nice too in that plaid-adjacent sort of mold, though may not have grabbed me quite as effectively as the more emotional moments on this thing. I don't really have much specific to say about this material beyond that. This is all stuff I've heard him do better before, so I don't expect this to be sticking with me longer term, but all of it works enough in the moment for me to still come away with positive-leaning feelings. It's definitely another Ochre album, and if that sounds like your thing, then check it out. I'm overall also feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on this one. Next up from Apparat, A Hum of Maybe. All of this is slow collision. And while we're on the topic of artists known for making fairly warm and friendly blends of IDM in the 2000s making somewhat long-awaited comebacks, here's a new one from Apparat, his first solo studio album since LP5 back in 2019, which I covered way back in the very first Some Stuff I Missed roundup, and I thought was decent but didn't really feel that strongly about. I'm not gonna act like I was going out of my mind with anticipation to hear this. For me, Apparat's best work is always gonna be Duplex from 2003 and Walls from 2007. His other stuff never came particularly close to sticking with me in the same way, either on the IDM side or on the alternative pop side of his style. The Moderat albums with Mode Selector definitely had their moments, though I distinctly remember the most recent one being a noticeable step down from the first three. Still, it had been a really long time since I'd heard something new from him, so that did make me just morbidly curious enough to see what he might have for this newest album anyway. And I'm actually glad I did sit with this. I was quite pleasantly surprised by what I ended up getting here. This album is by no means a home run, nor did it do much to change my somewhat lukewarm feelings on him on a general level. In fact, in some ways, this album is kind of a repeat of LP5, with a lot of similar issues kind of carrying over to this one. My biggest issue is still the guy's own lead vocals. Sasha Ring is not a technically bad singer, but his performances just have never moved me. I can kinda see him aiming somewhere along the James Blake or Tom York ballpark, but even speaking as someone who's not exactly the hugest fan of either of those artists, I don't feel like Apparat is nearly as expressive a singer as they can be. And more often than not, his vocal presence does more to get in the way of how much I can get emotionally invested. Also, for an artist trying for pop sensibilities, he does not seem to be the guy you go to for catchy hooks. This is not an album with structured tunes that can, really stick in your head easily. They're a lot more freeform, and it can almost feel like he's coming up with melodies partially on the fly without really a clear direction in mind. Still, this album does fairly significantly improve upon LP5's ideas and mixes. This album doesn't run together or fall in the background quite as much as that one did for me, and I feel like the instrumental backdrops were more detailed and dynamic in order to better make up for Apparat's vocal shortcomings. In fact, strangely enough, I found this album's instrumentals to have a pretty similar energy to what DeDrum was doing on his album last year. Obviously not nearly as good as that, but the mix of synths with various more organic instrumentation, like pianos and like guitars and strings and the like, does sort of carry a similar flighty and whimsical vibe to many parts of that album. And I also found the experience to run together much less than LP5 did. I can much more easily tell tracks apart from each other this time. There's a surprising amount of striking highlights here. See the especially Radiohead-coded opener Glimmering that has a really strong build-up, or the penultimate track Pieces Falling with By Disc, which feels like a fairly direct mirror to the progression the opener went on, but makes it work in its own separate way. Also really like the somewhat more propulsive synth passages in A Slow Collusion, the very pretty solo piano interlude Gravity Test, the somewhat jazzier approach to the title track featuring one of the album's strongest actual tunes. An Echo Skips a Name was a grower, whereas its somewhat simpler blend of wiry synth chords also added up to one of the more memorable tunes. The entirely instrumental Enough For Me that has something of a halftime chilled 2000s dubstep flavor beat to go up next to its chimes and harps almost feels like something I would hear out of an artist like Fela or something. That's cool. There's also a number of tracks which might not really work for me on the whole, thanks to too much focus on Apparat's vocals with fairly plain backdrops. But those tracks may also, often have moments I end up really liking. Like how Tilth not only has all these fairly striking stabby synth textures, but also a female guest vocalist, Karen, or however you say that, sorry. That gets that track to stand out more. Or how Lune starts out as a boring piano ballad, but suddenly turns into a rusty sound-alike halfway through out of nowhere. Or Williamsburg, which is also mostly just kind of a regular piano ballad, but works a little better and is made more impactful thanks to its particularly climactic burst of noise about halfway through. I feel like that track should have been the natural closer, and the actual closer recalibration could have easily just been cut altogether for not having anything in it of interest to note. But yeah, even if I have my clear issues with this thing, I did get a fair bit more out of it than I bargained for. I don't foresee it being a year-endless contender, and I'm not sure if it'll even be a long-term keeper, but it was a pleasant surprise. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from GRRRL, Beetle. Next up, here's a project I discovered from Vale Smith, highlighting it in one of his recent listening log videos. GRRRL is an experimental techno artist from North Carolina who's been at it for a while, although just recently signed with PC Music to put out what I believe is his 4th full-length album so far. I have not heard any of his other stuff aside from this project. I'm not typically one to pay that close attention to the output of PC Music as a label. The styles they're most well known for pushing, i.e. hyperpop, tends not to really be my thing. But still, hearing this album described to me as something of a roller coaster ride of loads of different hard-hitting hardcore club beat fragments had me curious enough to at least give it a shot. Now, in one breath, this album was a bit of a challenge for me since this is a track listing that not only has 24 tracks adding up to over 70 minutes of music, but all 24 of those tracks sound almost exactly the same, or at least pull from the exact same sound palette. Just loads of banging metallic kicks, off-kilter hardcore grooves, and some vocal sample fragments scattered around every now and then. Always the same set of vocal samples every time, even if the rhythms and editing vary from track to track. There's this sample that seems to show up at least once on nearly every track here. The constant pummeling beats all hitting the same note over and over and over from slightly different angles each time gave me mild flashbacks to when I saw Oudaker live last year, albeit GRRRL's mixes have much more actual defined structure and pulse than what I saw of that set. For as much substance as it looks like this project might have on the surface, it's not exactly the kind of thing that actually gives me much to say or left me super hungering to come back to it after it was done. Still, I'd also be lying if I said I found it quite as exhausting a listen as that might have sounded on paper either. There were definitely long stretches of the track listing where any minor rhythmic differences felt so negligible as to not matter, and I was pretty much just tuning the experience out. Hearing tracks like Moire and Twist with their hyper-stuttered vocal samples, or Indigo Sierra and Leaf Hopper with its laser-like synths might be fun. But they also sort of established formulas that would more or less get repeated ad nauseum for at least 2/3 of the track listing, save for maybe a You Can't here and there that might stick out for introducing exactly one new sample source. Although as repetitive as the experience may be, it didn't necessarily feel like it was losing the plot either. It has more the feel of a live set where the guy is just coming up with all these rhythms on the fly and the separations between tracks feel kinda arbitrary. And surprisingly enough, what saved this album from falling more into the 6 or 5 out of 10 range for me was this really strong closing stretch. Right around the point where if I had been experiencing this stuff live, I would probably be tapping out and starting to consider leaving the venue early. There's suddenly a bunch of executions of ideas that pulled me in a fair bit more than almost anything I'd heard for the previous 40 minutes. Starting from the track Rattlesnake, which stood out for changing the texture of the kicks and putting them up next to wiry pads in a way that felt like a sudden heightening of stakes. X-Metal and Hardshell lived up to the vibes promised by their titles, the former bordering on hardstyle, but still feeling propulsive and exciting enough to work. Mosquito and Honeybee found ways to hyper-stutter its tiny vocal fragments in such a specific way that actually ended up oddly slightly catchy. Honeybee in particular starting to almost pick up the tiniest hint of a disco flavor to the cadence of its beats. Firefly had all these super intense buzzing pads filling the mix that added texture to them that no other track previously had. And finally, the title track and closer not only felt like it got new textures of beats and synths and especially shouting samples to stutter, but also brought in a slight hint of actual melody underneath all the banging to make it feel extra climactic as a finish. So yeah, I guess those last 23 minutes or so kind of ended up just salvaging the experience for me to be able to say I had a good time with it. Am I going to be listening to this again? I kinda doubt it. I think one listen was enough for me, but there's definitely a certain audience this will be like really heavily appealing to, and while it did have me worried I was going to be really exhausted by it, I came out just satisfied enough to let this off with a light, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Robert Henke, Signal to Noise, Volume 2. Next up, we got a new one from none other than Robert Henke, better known as Monolake, releasing his first album under his real name since the 2000s, and making a sequel to his Signal to Noise album from all the way back in 2004. Truth be told, even though Monolake is one of my personal all-time favorite artists, and his work under that name has been extremely formative to my tastes going back as far as like my early high school years around the start of the 2010s, somehow I had never actually gotten around to hearing any of his albums he'd released under his real name, which focused significantly more on the straight ambient drone side of things rather than the ambient techno and IDM adjacent styles he explores as Monolake. Being the longtime fan that I am, I figured that is something I do not have any good excuse to not have under my belt at this point, so I took the opportunity of this latest release to finally catch myself up on those previous 6 records, and here's my very quick thoughts on those. This is actually Henke's first album release ever in 1994, predating anything he'd do in Monolake by a couple of years. It's an ambient drone record, though a solidly immersive one that surrounds you with cavernous dark ambience, dripping water sounds, and various electronic effects that also mimic the sound of water. Pretty cool stuff. Like the last album, but given a bit more structure by subdividing the experience into a few more distinct sections, some of which have more melody or pulse, and some that just straight up feel like electronically generated field recordings. It's excellent. Who would have guessed that the material, which came out around the same time as Hong Kong, and technically from the same people, would be a comparably well-crafted vibe? I mean, who would have guessed? Here's the album he's making a sequel to now. Part 1 is more stuff that sounds like his first album, Part 2 sounds more empty and drone-like with a bit more melody, and Studies for Thunder lives up to its title. It's an electronic recreation of Rainstorm. Nice stuff again, if a step down from his previous one. 10 more metallic ambient drone pieces of varying tones, mostly on the darker and more imposing end, but they're all really good and really sink me into their subspaces as to be expected. Whoa, okay, this one's different. There's a few tracks here which are dark ambient drones, but there's also some experimental techno that sounds like his regular Monolake stuff, and also a bunch of programmed classical piano pieces that turn high and low piano notes into like percussion textures to make it resemble his usual Monolake stuff. This is not a combination I was expecting, but I will certainly take it. It is really dang good. And going back full circle, here's another hour-long minimal ambient drone album with a lot of dripping water sound effects, I think loosely mirroring certain parts of CinemaScope, including the track Indigo, of course, but also kind of doing its own separate thing. Either way, it's nice. So that brings us to here. Very glad I finally got around to hearing those. It was pretty much what I expected for the most part, but there were in fact some keepers in there that I'm kind of slapping myself for having taken this long to get to. Now, I'm not really sure if the original Signal to Noise is one of those keepers. That album was quite good, but Floating Point and Layering Buddha did similar ideas better in a way that pulled me in more consistently. Still, I suppose I was game for another round of improvisational ambient drone material in a similar style. And yeah, I guess this was nice. Each piece on this album follows a certain formula. He set up 4 layers of ambient pads. There would be a drone playing one low bass note, a drone playing medium low bass note, a drone playing a high note, and a layer of him just kind of freely playing based on intuition. And that was pretty much it. Certainly the result is a pleasant listen that's able to hit both on some fairly warm and occasionally cinematic emotional notes, as well as some darker notes in some other spots. The whole thing certainly has a tenderness to it that I wouldn't be able to get out of any of the regular Monolake albums in the same way. And I suppose in the greater context of his catalog, that is something unique to this album and the first Signal to Noise. Although that's pretty much everything of substance I might have to note about any of this stuff. Unlike the first Signal to Noise, which had a part 1 that had more interesting synth effects to layer on top of the drones, and that whole Studies for Thunder piece, this album is all melodic drones like Signal to Noise Part 2, which was the least interesting part of that album for me. And there's nothing really to differentiate this set of tracks apart from each other beyond maybe like Part 6 starting out with a lot of higher notes, and Parts 8 and 9 bringing in some more Vangelis-y filter textures and brighter sequences, which was cool. And I guess Part 5 just happened to hit the deepest emotional note for me, although that almost seems like by happenstance. Let's be real, as much as I can always get enjoyment out of them, ambient drone albums like this are a dime a dozen. I could pretty easily find a similarly serviceable pleasant time poking around the ambient sections of Bandcamp for 5 minutes on any given day. And while Robert Henke is able to lean on his typical pitch-perfect production and mastering to make this stuff really full-sounding and spacious, I'd be lying if I thought he was bringing anything unique to the table here. This is the definition of a side project from an artist who is otherwise known for much better stuff than this. But also not to harp on it too much, it's not like it was trying to pass itself off as anything more than what it is. So yeah, it's not the kind of thing I probably would have been highlighting here if not for the opportunity it gave me to go back and hear some old stuff I've been meaning to hear, but this is neither a monotonous listen nor an emotionally inert listen. It achieved exactly what it set out to do, so I guess take that all as you will. Not essential listening, but it's decent, at least about on par with Indigo Transform, and maybe a bit better than that one, so yeah, I'll let it off with a 6.7 out of 10. Next up from Seafeel, Sol.Hz. Next up, got a new project from Seafeel. After already mounting solid comebacks with their Everything Squared and Squared Roots mini-albums in 2024, they've returned one more time with a proper full-length album to pay this whole era off. Off the premise of what they'd done on Everything Squared in particular, effectively combining their dream pop and shoegaze influences into a dubby ambient techno framework that distinctly felt like their own, and like it couldn't have come from any other artist. A project that legit got their work to click with me in a way that they hadn't previously. I was going into this project hoping to possibly even love it. Although I don't think this got me quite as hype as Everything Squared did. Now, it is very good. This album sees them specifically focusing on the darker and more instrumental heavy ends of that spectrum they explored on those mini-albums, specifically on the ambient dub sides of things, with lots of chilling 90s warp-style atmosphere with the occasional processed vocals in the background. And it's well executed for what it is. I just don't feel like the execution is quite as unique to them here as it was on Everything Squared. I feel like it's still probably more unique to them than either the really straightforward darker 90s IDM blends on Succour or the regular shoegaze blends on their self-titled album. But there's no like Skyhooks level home run on this thing. All of it is just a very nice immersive vibe without really like elevating itself to the next level for me. Though to be fair, it does come close to elevating to that level a few times. There were 4 tracks here that like really hit for me in particular. The tribal-like percussion mixes and whooshing windy pads floating through every days were really evocative, as were the warp synth riffs, airy vocals, and off-kilter lumbering percussion loop of the lead single Ever No Way. And there were 2 really strong and uplifting emotional heavy hitters too. The blend of pad melodies floating through Behind the Scene are absolutely gorgeous. And I feel like a similar warmer melodic idea is given even higher stakes on Falling First. I guess Am Flares isn't too far behind those highlights either. Kind of hits somewhere around the average sound of those 4 with warbling and flickering vocal effects taking space next to somewhat thicker bass lines and other warmer pads. And Humidity Switch is definitely the album's spookiest moment, with the pads starting to reach some mildly screechier ranges. And I guess Until Now might have some very mild acid licks in the background, even if it didn't otherwise introduce any new ideas that weren't done better by other tracks here. Oh yeah, and the album is bookended by 2 regular ambient drone pieces, which didn't really grab me that much. But yeah, that's pretty much all there is to Sol.Hz. There is some really good stuff, to be sure. Definitely enough here I enjoyed to still make it worth recommending, though it's more the kind of thing that leaves me feeling like maybe there was the potential for like a properly great album if I were to just take the best parts of this and like the best parts of everything squared and squared roots. They do all thematically fit together, but no single one of them reaches its highest possible potential if you take them purely on their own, so perhaps they may be better suited to picking and choosing from. I don't know, but on this album, I think I'm feeling like a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Cylle, Euphoria. Alright, next we got a new one from commercial trance artist Cylle. Wasn't sure what to expect given his previous album Illuminate, which I did a whole video on, was extremely all over the place, though this one was a much more uncomplicated good time. It definitely plays things very safe, sticks to the usual trance and down-tempo formulas you would expect. In fact, it's one of the safer and most straightforward entrants into his catalog overall, I think. But, you know, it's doing all the usual sounds well, still bringing the kinds of solid grooves and melodic atmosphere I'd want out of any new trance album. I'm just talking about the first disc, by the way. There is an entire live album included as a bonus second disc, though I did not listen to that. Anyway, so there are a few, like, German spoken word passages that periodically show up as some kind of, like, overarching conceptual element, even a passage that comes before the usual Willkommen intro, which caught me off guard a bit. I guess it's an attempt at, like, some kind of overarching concept, although I didn't really pay much mind to what was going on there. Anyway, the vocal tracks on this thing tended not to really stand out to me. The tunes behind them were just kind of there for the most part, though the instrumentals were all quite solid. Tracks like the title track, On a Journey, and Horizon all got quite propulsive and exciting. The latter's technically a vocal track, though the vocals don't really matter to that one that much. Der Traum and Clair de Lune were also major highlights, using vocals more texturally rather than a primary focus and adding up to fairly dramatic and spacey effects. On the slower side, I also quite like the trip-hop-ish tones of Phoenix 1 and 2, and the other two-parter that closes out the album, Der Siebte Himmel, brings in a full choir, which was quite impressive, especially in its second part. That's kind of everything I have to say about this stuff, though. Absolutely nothing earth-shattering. If you thought this was a boring dud that played things way too safe, I would not be able to argue with that. But, at least in my opinion, I felt like he brought just enough quality to make up for it. Perhaps it's not a keeper, but I think it is an enjoyable time for what it is, and I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. Next up from Alan Mock, Epoch. Alright, here's a random find I found out about after seeing Ramon Pang shouted out on Twitter. Second recommendation from him included here. This is a Japanese artist delivering his debut album, mixing bass music, classic dubstep, experimental techno, and IDM for quite possibly the densest new release I've heard all year so far. It's just over 70 minutes total, but every moment of this thing is absolutely packed with cool sound design workouts and sprawling tracks ranging anywhere from 3 to nearly 11 minutes, and the whole thing feels like it's steadily building an energy level and constantly changing and evolving the same semi-continuous mix over time. Like how Opener Vacation delivers a chilled two-parter mix built around halftime garage E-beats. A Brief History of Chime brings in lots of varied whooshing dubstep bass and a few wiry high-pitched chords, and Vim builds off both of the previous two tracks' ideas to make like a harder-hitting breakbeat banger, I guess. There's also a whole trilogy of tracks all called a hybrid kit that shows a greater extreme of this progression. The first one runs on for 8 minutes, delivering the album's most spare and stripped back mix by some distance. The second one chops up bird calls and zaps around to all sorts of unpredictable places from minimal bass to breezing breakbeat workouts again. And the third one is, in my opinion, the album's biggest and heaviest breakbeat banger of all, getting some mild flashbacks to, like, Oudiger's V-Proc with how crisp some of those breaks are. Beyond that, Midnight Blue probably has the most present melodies, even though it flows through several different change-ups and more growling bass. Run is just as propulsive as its title suggests, and Beat 0358 has all sorts of bubbly effects that remind me of some of the best moments of Robert Henke's albums under his real name, getting really granular while still having the time and space to carry on the banging breaks. Needless to say, this album is a lot, and it's also quite the challenging listen. I had to put this on a bunch of times in order to form any opinion on it. and it absolutely requires, like, sitting up and paying close attention to in order to get the most out of it. The length and general lack of melody certainly doesn't help in that regard, nor does the pacing sometimes. For instance, I was really hoping to get into the 11-minute centerpiece entitled track more than I did, and oddly both felt like one of the album's most static moments without having as many interesting evolutions as other moments here, while also feeling just, like, less distinct in the overall context of the album. But still, the sheer amount of substance this album packs in and how massively large scale it feels make this feel like something of a notable highlight of the year so far. I think I'm going to keep it around to see whether it even further grows on me, but yeah, I think this can get away with a light, solid 8 out of 10. Next up from James Blake, Trying Times. Alright, let's try a James Blake album again. I've always held this guy's work at something of a distance. I can always respect how ridiculously influential he's been on so many artists, both in my space and out of it. He's had plenty of albums I think are really good, and none of his albums are outright stinkers to me. Though, I can't say I properly love any of his albums or felt the urge to keep them or any of them around longer term either. He did come close with his last album, Playing Robots into Heaven, which I initially loved when it first dropped in mid-2023, although that ended up growing off me too. It was primarily being carried by like a really strong opening 3-track stretch, and the rest, while interesting, it kind of lost some of its luster the more time I spent with it. This latest one was getting plenty of good reviews across the board, though, from pretty much all sides that I saw, so that at least had me intrigued to see what he was going to deliver this time around. And, well, this does feel like one of his better ones, though it kind of elicited the same reaction most of his stuff does for me, of being all around nice in the moment, if not a keeper. While it's on, it's exceptionally pretty, but most of it disappears from my head right after it's done. Now, to be clear, there are actually quite a lot of really strong standouts here. The opener walkout music is a very strange start, but I fuck with it. The synth washes, pitched up vocal samples, and random trap beats feel very scattered, but add up to some strong payoffs. Death of Love has some absolutely gorgeous choir backing and gospel-y influences, super imposing and spacious. I like the interpolations of the doo-wop sample on I Had a Dream She Took My Hand, especially like the big dramatic payoff at the end. And I feel like Make Something Up also has some of that kind of vibe, but with a more energetic mix with some hip-hop beats and thicker guitars, quite like that one. And Didn't Come to Argue as this really nice old-school 60s soul or Motown-y flavor to its balladry with some very pretty strings, as well as a random change-up in its second half to a more dance-centric mix with guest vocals from Monica Martin. That's definitely one of the best here. I thought the track with Dave made for a nice change of pace, even if the off-kilter instrumental wasn't among my favorites. And the last major highlight for me was Rest of Your Life. Of course, the most up-tempo dance jam on the album with all the house pianos was going to appeal to me. So tracks like those can, once again, like, inherently prevent me from coming out of this thing with outright negative feelings. Although outside of standouts like those, the rest of this can be kind of hit and miss for me. None of it is bad, but there's plenty of tracks that don't really grab me, or maybe have one minor element that doesn't quite work for me, like the I Love You samples on Days Goodbye. And the ending stretch of 3 tracks just kind of fell flat for me too. I get how those tracks would hit for other people, but I was getting kind of sick of the vibe by that point, and the tunes weren't strong enough to pull me back in. The strings on the closer nearly did it for me, but the tune itself was too listless and dull to connect all the way. So yeah, Trying Times does fall for a lot of the same issues that I've had with many other James Blake albums, and is among his most consistent efforts for me personally, though I cannot deny some of the standouts here are absolutely beautiful. I do like a lot of the old school soul flavors in many parts, and the reverby atmospherics through the whole thing. I think I can get away with qualifying it as a good album, even if, just barely. So yeah, feeling an extremely light, solid 7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Lorraine James, Detached from the Rest of You. Okay, this was one I was particularly looking forward to. Lorraine James is one of those names that's been really sneaking up on my listening rotation lately. I may not have quite connected with her fairly muted, glitchy, and IDM and bass music adjacent mixes initially, and found some of her projects, especially earlier on, to come off a little too lifeless for my liking, but some of her stuff has grown on me quite a bit. I think her 2022 album, Building Something Beautiful for Me, still probably stands as my favorite thing she's put out to date, for its combination of somewhat blunt but very prescient social commentary on anti-blackness and anti-queerness, with some very tightly constructed but also expansive and emotionally resonant IDM mixes, recontextualizing compositions by composer Julius Eastman into a sometimes dreamlike mix that fully felt like her own. Although her 2023 album Gentle Confrontation has also been a particular grower as well, for being easily her most expansive and well-varied work to date, while also feeling extremely personal and intimate. I recently saw her highlight that one as her favorite of her albums so far, and I can definitely see why. Even if I stand by that album having some structural issues that hold it back from really going the extra mile for me, it certainly has loads of her most impressive moments yet, and felt like it was unlocking even further potential for her. With those albums having snuck up on me as much as they have lately, I was definitely excited to see what she'd be delivering for this most recent effort. This album is a bit of a shift for her into what she's half-jokingly referred to as her IDM pop star album, showing her taking her usual glitchy sound and forming tracks that somewhat more resemble pop songs. Many tracks here feature vocal guests and center around their appearances, and the ones that don't feature guests show James centering her own vocals, delivering her usual ruminations on her own insecurities and self-doubt in creating art. And I think it all comes together quite effectively. It does feel like a solid progression from what she did on Gentle Confrontation. Maybe not as sprawling in scale, but these mixes have gotten more tuneful without losing any of the core of what makes her particular sound and style unique. And nearly every track here is a highlight for me in some way. I will say the tracks where James takes the lead vocals herself tended not to be quite as big highlights on average as the ones with the guest vocalists, if only because they felt kinda like retreads of ideas that I felt like she did better on Gentle Confrontation. Even if they all had plenty of relatable lyrics about self-doubt and depression and creative frustration and that kind of thing, although she did also show up for two of my biggest favorites on this thing. I really like the opener A Long Distance Call and how heavily it just stutter edits its synths and samples before eventually taking more songful form over time. And the penultimate track, Forever Still Steel, is the album's biggest scale climax, running over 7 minutes and making very good use of that length. Especially the first 2-3 minutes with all the crazy live drum sounds that really make the mix much more energetic before settling into something much more introspective for the second half. Oh yeah, and the closer See-Through is really nice as well, especially like the glacier melodies in the beginning of that one. Beyond that, tracks like In a Rut and Score feature airy female guest vocalists Sydney Span and Anicia Kim, respectively, and feature some of the album's warmest and most welcoming tunes. I really like the flute textures on Score in particular. The intro Flatline with Miho Hattori brings in a bit of Japanese spoken word before settling into its hook. Peak Again might have been the most straightforward pop tune out of all the tracks here, with simple vocals from Alan Sparhawk promoting love over war on top of an instrumental that reminds me quite a bit of the track Dropsicle by Casino vs. Japan. Really mess with that. Habits and Patterns with Tears Eye isn't among the catchiest of tunes, but I do quite like all the pianos and Ryoji Ikeda style micro glitches all over the instrumental of that one. And that leaves easily the album's craziest and most energetic banger, ending us all with LE3 Black and Finn Dobson. The jazzy breakbeats almost border on having like some early Amon Tobin-ish energy to them, while going up next to all the impassioned rap verses and dramatic but icy synth pads. That one really floored me. So yeah, that's about all I have to say on Detached from the Rest of You. All around really impressed with what James had to pull out for this one, feeling more easily accessible than other projects of hers while maintaining every bit of the easily recognizable style she's built up over the last near decade at this point. I don't think I'd call it my absolute favorite work she's ever put out as a whole, but it's got some more of her best individual moments to date, and certainly its arrival might be inspiring me to put her on an even more heavy rotation. Between this and her last two albums in particular, her stuff has really started to warm up to me. I could see this continuing to grow on me with more time. We'll see how that goes, but in the meantime, I'm feeling a very strong 7.7 out of 10. Next up from Max Cooper, Feeling is Structure. Next up, goddamn, we already have a new full-length Max Cooper album only a year after the last one. Talk about a quick turnaround. I mean, it's basically a less memorable repeat of his album from last year. There's no ideas I haven't already heard him do plenty of times, and I don't know if any single one of these tracks stands among my favorites from him ever. Also unfortunate for him that he decided to put this out in a year that even this early on has already had no shortage of quality IDM, leading to this not quite standing out enough for me to want to keep around longer term, but hey, he brings the same level of sound design expertise he always does to everything he releases, and this is a more exciting listen than I remember Unspoken Words being. The biggest highlight is probably the opener, Pattern Index, which starts as this intricate mosaic of low-key synth blips, but builds up this disco-y beat underneath, until paying off into a pretty epic climax by the end. The most high-detail track might have been This Is a Bridge with Sorcery. That just throws so many micro sounds at you over this way more frantic and faster-paced beat. I also quite like the dark dubstep-flavored workouts in obsessive-compulsive order, and there's two really nice glitchy ambient pieces in the epic and expansive Splintered Air Between Us, and the much more emotive closer Chrysalis. The latter is also definitely one of my favorites here. Though that's pretty much all for the moments that stood out to me the most. Everything else is just as intricately detailed and complex in its sound design, but again, pretty much all these tracks just feel like they're following after ideas he's already done better, especially on his last album, and with this having come out in such close proximity to On Being, I'd be lying if I said they landed with as much impact as I would want. At the end of the day, still a good album that has nothing wrong with it. If this had come with, like, different release timing and projects like that Alan Mock thing I shouted out earlier, or even the Lorraine James thing I just got done talking about hadn't satisfied my hunger for this type of material, along with other names I'll be discussing later in this roundup, perhaps I would have been able to get into it more easily. As it is, it's definitely another new Max Cooper album carrying all the same expectations that would come with that. If you're game for that, check it out. Just don't expect an Emergence tier home run here. So yeah, light 7.5 out of 10, I guess. Next up from Maquinaria Mechanica, Orden de Acero. To give myself a brief break from the IDM, how about some Peruvian industrial EBM? Way back in, I think, the Volume 10 roundup in 2022, I covered this band's debut album, Somos Machina. I quite enjoyed its super hard-hitting, but still fairly accessible industrial synth grooves with fairly left-wing lyrics in Spanish calling for workers' rights. And this sophomore album, 4 years later, delivers even more of that. This is not exactly an album that gives me a lot of detailed things to say or break down, but all of it viscerally hits for what it's going for. More shouted lyrics in Spanish decrying liberal state oppression, the lack of resources and poor living conditions for the working class, the media pushing lies in order to keep people biased and polarized, the prison industrial complex, genocides all over the world, even the way the global south follows the whims of American and European imperial interests, and of course lots of calling for revolution and raging against the machines. Unfortunately getting more and more relevant with each passing year. And instrumentally, even though all 10 of these tracks sound functionally the same, every single one of them is a banger with aggressive synth bass lines and thick metallic percussion, forming lots of super visceral industrial dance grooves, exactly as hyper-propulsive and adrenaline-fueled as you'd hope. I think their first album might have been a slight hint better produced and mastered, particularly in like the recording fidelity of their mics, but it's not that noticeable a difference. I think I still like this album a little bit more than their first one just because there was more of it and the experience felt that little bit fuller. In any case, if you just want a pummeling good time with some hard-hitting radical politics, then I can endorse any of their stuff as being worth giving a shot. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Bifu Zone, The West. And on the complete polar opposite end of the tonal spectrum, this roundup surprisingly hasn't had too much in the way of like random Bandcamp daily finds and artists I had just like previously never heard of before at all. I feel like I haven't gotten much of the luck of the draw with those lately, but one that did really stand out to me as being pretty neat was this project from Japanese artist Bifu Zone, also known as Tsudio Studio, delivering an ambient record with vaporwave influences and a lot of saxophones themed around Japanese architecture and liminal spaces. Now that's my kind of shit, and this is a particularly well-executed blend of it. Opener Cosmo Sound In really sets the tone well with its super spacious blend of synth blips, pads, and sax soloing that really adds up to that really calming new agey vibe. RIC Midnight brings in the most obvious vaporwave influence in the choice of percussion loops and the way the melodies echo away over them. It sounds like it could be a stretched out sample even though it isn't. Meteor Plaza has all these super tinkly high-pitched keyboards adding up to a children's music box lullaby type vibe. Lamer brings in some warmer acoustic guitar. Sumarikyu Park brings in all these marimba sounds and reminds me of the Hennenbo minigame in Electroplankton in some moments. There's an extremely niche reference there, I'm sure at least a couple people will get. Twin 21 is just a really sweet emotional MIDI piano piece, and it ends in Herbis Ent with all these light, well-layered chime textures surrounding the mix. Absolutely none of this stuff is exactly reinventing the wheel as far as ambient music and new age and that kind of thing, but it does really hit the spot on a personal level. I can see myself keeping this around, and we'll see if it ends up further growing on me. In the meantime, this gets a strong 7.7 out of 10 as well. Next up from Lone, Hyperphantasia. Alright, here was one of my more highly anticipated albums of the year. We got a new one from Lone, his first full-length album since Always Inside Your Head in 2021. Although some of the singles from this album were released as far back as 2023, so it's been quite a long time coming. And I'm quite happy to report that it is one of his strongest albums to date. It's nothing you haven't heard from him before. It's a very bright and colorful mix of standard formulas of house, UK garage, hip-hop, new age, breakbeat, jungle, and whatever other 90s throwback dance styles. In a lot of ways, it's kind of a culmination of all the kinds of sounds he's been exploring for years, combining the approaches of albums like Galaxy Garden and Reality Testing and Levitate and Emerald Fantasy tracks all together all in one place. Though this is also notable for being one of his most up-tempo and banger-centric albums to date as well. Most of his albums have a lot of focus on also slower and more down-tempo moments, and this one has some of that too, but I felt like this one just kept the energy level a fair bit higher on average than what I would have expected for a new Lone record. Even though the album's almost exactly an hour long, there could still be moments even later in the track listing that could get me really hyped and excited. The album's lowest key moments tend to be isolated to much shorter interlude tracks, which might have been a bit hit and miss. Some of them, like Photographs That Don't Exist or Sickly Sweetly Summer Movie, could deliver some nice spacious ambience, though others like the Mind Apple intro or Opening a Portal included some fake deep spoken word passages which I could have done without. Although interludes like these obviously pale in comparison to all the Meteor core tracks, which pretty much all hit. My attention will never be trailing off for long on this thing. Tracks like Life Spark, Affinity, Cloud 44 Mix, Triton, and Scattergun have lots of gorgeously bright and airy vocal samples to implement into their hard-hitting house and garage grooves. Some tracks hit in a similar way with a more traditional vocal guest, like on the especially atmospheric Miracle Mile with Bebo Code, or the 90s hip house influenced We Move with Eli Murphy. Meanwhile, other tracks go for some jungle breakbeat influences, like the especially pretty 7-minute centerpiece Waterfall Reverse, or the closer Ascension.png, which starts out with some tropical island steel drums and a more down-tempo blend before really kicking into high gear in its second half. And other moments throw a little bit of a curveball, like how Throw the Ember with Juggernaut switches over into some straight hip-hop territory and fits just as well into his usual bright and colorful style as always. I've seen this compared to more recent machine drum productions, and I can definitely see the parallels. There's also a couple of trip-hop influenced cuts that maybe slow the tempo down a decent bit, but still feel just as flashy to fit with everything else. Maybe I didn't feel as strongly about Home with Mary Lam Lam as much as other moments here didn't grab me as a major highlight, though still good. And Big World with Lou Hader was a bit more impressive for me. I found its melodic flares to be quite a bit more striking with harder hitting beats. So yeah, while I don't think this album is going to be changing anyone's life, it is definitely living up to the aesthetics of its cover and providing a relieving brand of escapist fantasy through dance music that's very easy to like and all around very full-sounding and well-crafted. Other albums of his may have higher high points. There's nothing here on the level of, like, Crystal Caverns 1991 or Airglow Fires, but this one just kept bringing the hits and never got boring, so I gotta give my thumbs up to it. Can definitely keep this one around. I'm feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. Next up from Tipper, Cloaked. Oh, a new Tipper album. Great. You know, I want to be able to look forward to this guy's stuff more. He has released plenty of great music over the years, and his style does appeal to my taste pretty easily, but I've not really enjoyed dealing with this dude's fan base. If you don't mind me going on a bit of a rant, first of all, some people have proven to take, like, even minor criticisms of the guy's work super personally. When I reviewed Jettison Mindhatch with the In Brief segment back in the day and thought his catalog ranged from albums I think are properly great to or amazing to just decent, and that album in particular was merely good if nothing mind-blowing for me. Lots of people got absolutely livid that I didn't think it was literally the greatest album ever made in history. Now, the Tipper fanbase is obviously far from unique in that regard. Stands be thin-skinned, what else is new? But what made them feel like a special brand of weird to me was after I reviewed Marble Hunting a few years later and thought that album was great and one of his best. Ended up making my year-end list too. But a whole bunch of his fans still got up my ass about it, told me I didn't get it, and that I needed to see his live concert in order to speak on him properly. I tried explaining in that video that I personally couldn't afford to see him live, not just because of the regular ticket price, but also because I live in the Chicago area, and he never played anywhere remotely close to me, so the travel expenses would, like, really put him out of my price range. But even after explaining that, the fans only got louder about his live shows, poking me at random times and random videos that had nothing to do with Tipper, just to make sure I knew I had to see him live really soon, because he's planning to retire from touring, and just aggressively talking about how impossible it would be for me to get anything less than a life-changing spiritual experience out of seeing him. And I was just like, okay, y'all need to chill the fuck out. It's just a damn concert. I'm sure his concerts are great, from small clips I've seen on YouTube, and from what I heard in that Sunrise at the Gorge live album he released last year. It sounds like it would have been a really fun time, but I didn't want to set up, like, a whole-ass GoFundMe for the purposes of shutting up a bunch of dude bros. And some of those people just had a weird energy around his show, implying that, like, a regular good or even great time, or anything less than an 11 out of 10 time would not be sufficient. Elevating the show to a level of hype that I don't think anyone is capable of living up to on any reasonable level, and I just know for a fact that if I actually had the chance to see a show in person and that inevitably thought it was just a regular fun time rather than literally changing the entire course of my life, the fans would still riot and yell at me because I don't do drugs. My apologies for being too poor and living in the wrong part of the country and thereby not even having a chance to be able to see the guy perform in person, but even with that in mind, some of these people have just made it kind of weird. If anything, the pressure they were putting on the concerts did more to put me off and made me want to see them less. Now, obviously, none of this nonsense is Tipper's own fault, and obviously this is not to say that all of his fans are that level of head-ass and cultish. There are plenty of reasonable ones, too. But there were enough of them that weirded me out to the point where I actively didn't even really feel comfortable covering him in another dedicated video, even though I know that would have done more numbers than putting it here. At the very least, it appears the guy's still releasing studio music, so now that he doesn't play live at all anymore, hopefully y'all can just let me enjoy his studio output and let this stuff stand on its own in peace. I think the guy's legacy in electronic music history is more than secure without the help of his most obnoxious stans. But I digress. I just really had to get all that off my chest. That's been eating at me for quite a while now. I guess in any case, hopefully the fans can take at least some solace in the fact that I think this latest album of his, Cloaked, is also one of his best. At least roughly on par with Marble Hunting, and might even be a bit better depending on my mood. It is aiming to be like another one of his more down-tempo works in the vein of Forward Escape and Jettison Mind Hatch, but this particular batch of material showed him really upping his melody game both emotionally and structurally in such a way that gave these tracks much more of a sense of focus and purpose than I've tended to feel out of other down-tempo IDM material he's made. And where a lot of the stuff on Forward Escape and Jettison Mind Hatch could often feel to me like directionless jam sessions that would run together really easily, these tracks, like the ones on Marble Hunting, are much more easily distinct and recognizable apart from each other. Certainly this album has to be my favorite album opener on any Tipper album ever by like quite a distance. I may not love its title Goldilocks Zone, but holy shit, those fucking 70s movie soundtrack strings are absolutely freaking gorgeous. They've got like some Nightmares on Wax, Les Nuits type energy, and the way he built his usual squelchy down-tempo bass music mixes on top of them and jazzy electric pianos and harps and stuff, just, oh my god, I was not at all prepared for that opener. That got to me on such an immediate level that I don't think any track from Tipper ever really has to this degree before. Now, the rest of the album did not floor me on the level of the opener, but he did keep bringing the emotional weight to back up his usual sound design muscle. The title track brings in some strings and pianos to add some cinematic weight to all the squelching bass and old school dubstep beats. Meadow Foam, interestingly, adds up to a similar effect with like some dub techno-flavored synth chord progressions. And the warmer pad builds and chimes and scaffolder were growers over time and repeat listens. Tracks like Magpies and Little Peaks build solid hooks out of lots of bright stabby melodies. The former of those has this whole Indian-inspired breakdown in the middle and a lot of crazy DJ scratching, while Wookstock has the album's heaviest bass squelching, delivering the mix that probably would have fit most at home on his last album. And the album's whole ending stretch is very solid too. Lucy's combines all these fluttery ascending synth riffs with slap bass and I think some plucked Asian strings and stuff. Preparations for Departure as all these warm and comfy electric piano melodies that both remind me of some of his earlier like Seamless Unspeakable Something era stuff, as well as maybe a bit of Radiohead Kid A, before the big string washes and the bass drops of clicking noises come back in. And finally, Launchers finishes the album on a real sense of urgency and forward momentum with its much more dramatic melodic flares, even if the urgency is sometimes momentarily paused by the bass drops. Now, not every track here is an absolute home run. I like the melodies on tracks like Kites Couldn't Even and Pono and the Green Flash bonus track, though there wasn't like any particular texture they had that other tracks here didn't deliver in a more striking way to me. And Dispasio falls in a similar category for me as well, though that track's not even really trying with the melodies as much, mostly just trying for pure sound design workout while cycling through pretty much like all the same sounds that I would expect on pretty much any Tipper production. And those tracks are all good, to be absolutely clear. I do still like all of those and I don't skip them. They're just not major standouts or personal favorites in the track listing. If it sounds like I'm being picky, that's because I hold the guy to a high standard, knowing what he's capable of at his absolute best. And while this album is definitely one of his best, it doesn't beat like Broken Soul Jamboree or The Critical Path for me. Marble Hunting is also still very close, or at least on an equal level to this, because that was a much tighter all-killer, no-filler listen for me than this one was. But even so, I gotta say, kudos to Tipper for the material he did bring here, really playing to all his biggest strengths as a producer and composer while actively fighting against a lot of his impulses that have made some other albums of his harder for me to get into. This feels like it's doing something like Jettison Mind Hatch again, but actually addressing pretty much all of my biggest issues with that album. Feeling much better designed to be listened to out of context instead of being a compilation of live show highlights or something. I don't know, I'm sure I've made plenty of the guy's fans unhappy with my observations yet again, since I don't consider this album or all of his albums ever to be literally perfect in every way, but even if y'all aren't happy, I at least came out happy with this album. I think it's great. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on it. And finally, from Cylob, In Dystopia. And to close this roundup out, it's time to return to my most common wheelhouse of 90s IDM artists. And here's a somewhat lesser known one that I've never gotten around to before. real name Chris Jeffs, known for being one of the earlier signees to Reflex Records before breaking off in the 2000s and going independent for the rest of his tenure, as well as for being an occasional associate to Aphex Twin himself back in that guy's heyday. He's an artist I've vaguely known about for a while, but just never got around to before. I've gotten various recommendations to check his stuff out in my comments, so he'd been on my radar for a minute, although the release of this latest album gave me the perfect opportunity to finally go back and catch myself up. So, I went back and listened to all his studio albums out so far, just the mainline full-length albums under the Cylob name, no side projects or EPs or that kind of thing, which already leaves me with 13 total albums, including this newest one, so I had a decent amount to go through. And here's my quick thoughts on those. Alright, as a bit of a prologue, he originally released this under the name Kinesthesia in early 1996, but later reissued it as a Cylob album in 2014, so I counted it as a Cylob album. It's a nice collection of melodic synth pieces that, surprise, feature a lot of early Aphex Twin or maybe Boards of Canada adjacent flavors. I guess the latter weren't a thing yet at the time of recording. I have heard a shit ton of stuff that sounds like this over the years, and this doesn't exactly stand out from the crowd that much, but it's still an enjoyable time for what it is. This was his proper debut, and the one that most frequently got recommended to me. It's, once again, an extremely familiar vibe for me. He and RDJ had very similar approaches to composition at the time. A few cuts here even remind me of specific Aphex Twin tracks like Thaw, Curtains, and Wet Tip Henax. And the crunchier beatwork here also reminds me of some of the stuff Mike Paradinas was doing around that time as well. But again, Cylob was literally right there on the scene with those guys at the time. It probably wouldn't be a stretch to say they were all low-key influencing each other. And I don't think it's Cylob's fault that his work here somewhat forced an unfair comparison with material I literally grew up with. In any case, it's still a very solid and pleasant time with a lot of moody and melancholic undertones, and the closer and title track in particular is a big winner. Well, this is exactly what it says on the tin, Mood Bells. It's a bunch of short ambient bell pieces, and that's it. The idea might wear out its welcome a little bit by the end, but I like bells and mood pieces of this variety, so I liked this album. Alright, here's where he broke off Reflex and went independent. This album was originally released in 2007 as a single continuous mix called Trojan Fader Style, but all the streaming services separate the tracks out into an album called Trojan Tracks. The latter version was what I heard. This can occasionally fall a bit on the samey and tuneless side for my liking in many moments, but I do have to appreciate him starting to nail down more of a recognizable sonic identity he can call his own, bridging a gap between lo-fi DIY moodiness and goofy quirkiness. It's nice. Got some Drexia vibes in a few bits too, which was cool. He also released 2 more albums in the same year. This one's more stuff like the last album, but with more synth-pop influence and better tunes and melodies. He's also trying to make some squirty synth leads imitate vocals with actual lyrics. It's quite difficult to make out what they're saying, but given a few of those track titles, I think I'm fine with that. The third album he released that year is technically a set of unreleased material he made around 94 and 95. But it might also low-key be my actual favorite album of his. It's a collection of various synth doodles that range from melancholic ambience to playful goofiness to heavy and ghostly dark ambience, and frequently hit some solid emotional notes without ever getting samey or dull or falling in the shadow of his more popular contemporaries. Really nice stuff. 8 years later, he comes back with another collection of synth doodles in the same vein as the previous project, except I think there's some microtonal stuff and the whole thing's less well-varied or memorable in general. And then fast forward to the pandemic, where his output really starts speeding up. This is pretty much just a straight throwback to the 90s warp artificial intelligence sound, complete with plenty of acid. It's fine. The synth pads are nice and immersive though. And this is a collection of regular old acid bangers, so straightforward that it could have passed for late period Luke Vibert. Well, there's also a couple of tracks that start bordering on crazy experimental noise too. Those were cool. Oh hey, it's the return of the vocoders on another electro synth pop record. The vocals are even more intelligible here than last time, so yeah, it's nice. More abstract instrumental IDM stuff that brings in some nicer melodies. One of his more enjoyable efforts in a little while. Kind of a mix of different ideas that would have fit on the last 2 albums. So that brings us to here. I don't know if I would say that Cylob is going to become like a new all-time favorite artist for me or anything, but I can certainly respect his place in history and understand where he gets his small but dedicated cult following from. Anyway, this latest album of his, In Dystopia, is another round of vocoder IDM synth pop in the same vein as his albums Formant, Potaton, and especially Placeholder. Maybe not always among his most popular, consistently fan-acclaimed modes of operation, but hey, if it means anything, this is my favorite of his vocal-centric pop albums to date, and it did grow on me the more times I put it on. It's not an album that I have a lot of detailed things to say about, but I liked it. I'm not really going to delve much into the lyrics, since while these tracks are all quite wordy, I'm not sure what any of them mean. Tracks could be about love, social alienation, the modern times, insecurity, day-to-day life, I don't know. The metaphors are all like jumbled and obtuse and couldn't mean any number of things. But A, obtuse and confusing is still probably preferable to me over I want to see you naked. And B, it's not like this kind of music really needs to have super profound lyrics to hit. The core appeal mostly lies in the evocative and complex melodic constructions, the quirky retro synth and classic electro instrumentals, and this kind of laid-back and forlorn vibe. The vocals tend to be treated as just another melodic synth lead. Most of these tracks would give me the exact same kind of things to say. I suppose some of the better tunes include In the Bed of an Ocean, No Use for the Warning, and A Quiet Life. The latter I feel might have some, like, intangible Disney-ish undertone, but I mess with it. I found My Tribe is one of the brightest and most energetic ones, too, and I like the string intro and acid breakdowns on Hit the Buffer as well. Only track that maybe didn't quite work for me was the closer IT Full Freeze, which got a bit irritating. Although I will say there were two big standouts on this album in particular that hit a higher height for me than all the others. One of them was You Never Toiled for Humanity, which shows Cylob actually letting his real vocals take the focus, and keeping the vocoders to more of a minimum. And the tune he delivers is actually really touching and vulnerable in a way that I was not expecting. That one definitely got to me, and my other big favorite was Jump Off the Treadmill. I really like how he trades between like these higher and lower pitched vocal melodies in the chorus, make it sound like a duet in a stage musical or something. That was really cute too. But yeah, that's kind of all I have to say on this one. I would not go into this album expecting anything life-changing. It's just kind of a cute little electro-synth pop record and that's it. Not the best stuff I've ever heard in this genre, but it's hard to dislike. Like most Cylob records, it's just a nice, enjoyable time. And if it sounds like it'd be your thing, then check it out. And also check out the EP he released after it called Show Us Another World Is Possible. That one is all instrumental and is also very nice in his more abstract bag. But I digress. On In Dystopia, I'm overall feeling 7.3 out of 10. Alright, and that's gonna be it. That's the roundup. That was kind of brutal to record, but whatever, we got through it. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, the link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.